Hello everybody, welcome back to Book of Kings, where we discuss topics such as history, religion, philosophy, psychology, culture, and more, and the way that they all interact with one another. Don't forget to like, leave a comment, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to receive a notification every time I release a new video. Hope you enjoy. When talking about modern intractable conflicts, there is one conflict which comes to mind more than any other as being unparalleled with regard to its length as well as its level of controversy and divisiveness, and that is the Israel Palestine conflict. Following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I, the Zionist movement would pursue aspirations of creating a Jewish state in the former Ottoman region of Palestine. This would become a reality in 1948 following the UN partition of the region and upon the Israeli conquest of the territories which would make up the State of Israel, with Israel's defeat of a coalition of Arab states. Jordan and Egypt would gain control of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip respectively. However, following a series of escalations between Israel and neighboring Arab countries, which would culminate in the Six-Day War of 1967, Israel would occupy the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, gaining control of all of what had been the region of Palestine. Between 1967 and 1977, Israel would begin small-scale settlement of the West Bank, transferring 3,200 Israelis into the territory, with settlements concentrated around the Palestinian population of Jerusalem and in the Jordan Valley. Land that had been abandoned by Palestinians displaced by war would come under Israeli custodianship and would rarely be returned to the original owner, particularly if the land had been sold to a settler group. Additionally, Israel would implement a policy which would remain in place from that point forward, whereby any Palestinian from Jerusalem could have their residency revoked by Israeli law if Jerusalem does not remain their quote-unquote center of life for 7 years, which has been applied to over 1,400 Palestinians from 1967 to 2016. 1977 would witness a major turning point in Israeli politics, when for the first time since Israel's creation 29 years earlier, the left-wing Labour Party would be defeated in the parliamentary elections by a conservative party, namely the Likud party, led by former Irgun leader Menachem Begin, which had been established by supporters of the revisionist variant of Zionism. By the end of the Labour Party's term in power with this election, 4,500 Israelis had settled in 30 settlements in the West Bank proper and 500 settlements in East Jerusalem. The Likud party under Begin would promote the idea of a Greater Israel, with their original party platform calling for the immediate annexation of the West Bank, stating quote-unquote, "Between the sea and the Jordan, there will only be Israeli sovereignty." This would lead to an incremental expansion of the settlement project, which would provide Israelis with incentives to settle in the occupied West Bank and would reaffirm Israel's annexation of East Jerusalem, being codified into law by the Israeli Knesset, or Parliament, with the Jerusalem Law of 1980, rekindling international controversy and condemnation from the UN with Security Council Resolution 478 due to East Jerusalem being internationally recognized as Palestinian territory. The re-election of Likud in 1981 would lead to a rapid expansion of settlements, with settlers in the West Bank numbering at over 28,000, receiving benefits such as government mortgage and housing subsidies, tax incentives, business grants, free education, infrastructure projects, and defense from the IDF. In 1981, Israel would effectively annex the Golan Heights, something which would not be recognized by the international community and the United Nations, with the Golan Heights being recognized as belonging to Syria. In response to the continued occupation and settlement of the territories of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip captured by Israel in 1967, which at this point had lasted for nearly 20 years, the Palestinians of the occupied territories would engage in an uprising against the Israeli occupation known as the First Intifada, the Arabic word for uprising, which would break out in December 1987. This intifada would consist of waves of uncoordinated protests, which primarily consisted of non-lethal means of resistance, such as throwing stones, setting up roadblocks, throwing Molotov cocktails, and burning tires. Israel would respond with a violent crackdown, resulting in some instances of lethal violence by Palestinians, in total resulting in the death of at least 1,087 Palestinians, 240 of which were children, and the death of 100 Israeli civilians and 60 Israeli soldiers. Conflict would continue for the next 6 years until 1993, when Israel, under the leadership of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, would enter into negotiations with PLO leader Yasser Arafat, resulting in the signing of a pair of accords known as the Oslo Accords, the first of which would be signed on September 13, 1993, and a second accord which would be signed on September 28, 1995. With the signing of the first accord, the PLO, while accepting UN Security Council Resolution 242, which calls for the withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from the occupied territories, as well as Resolution 338, would recognize the State of Israel, renounce the use of terrorism and violent resistance, and commit itself to the peace process in order to negotiate a peaceful solution to the conflict in exchange for Israel recognizing the PLO as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people and as a bilateral negotiation partner, which would begin negotiations with Israel, and set out a transitional period, creating the Palestinian Authority as an interim organization to administer limited government in the Palestinian territories for no longer than 5 years, during which time permanent status negotiations would take place. Rabin, however, would note that Israel did not accept Palestinian aspirations for an independent state, but affirmed support for a quote-unquote separate Palestinian entity short of a state. The second accord would be signed on September 28, 1995, with the goal set to begin negotiations on a permanent resolution leading to the implementation of Resolutions 242 and 338 no later than May 4, 1996, and allowing shared government of the Palestinian territories in the West Bank between Israel and the PLO, now acting as the newly formed Palestinian Authority, whereby the West Bank would be divided into different areas A, B, and C. Area A would consist of islands of non-contiguous urban areas, forming approximately 18% of the total land area of the West Bank, which the Palestinian Authority would administer exclusively. Area B would consist of islands of non-contiguous rural areas, making up roughly 22% of the West Bank, under Palestinian civil control and joint Israeli-Palestinian security control. And Area C would consist of 60% of the geographical area of the West Bank, excluding East Jerusalem, which Israel had previously annexed, and would include all of the areas in between the isolated enclaves of Area A and B, as well as the Jordan Valley, which covered the entire border between the West Bank and Jordan, and would be administered exclusively by Israel via the Israeli civil administration, with the exception of the Palestinian Authority providing educational and medical services. 70% of Area C is off-limits to Palestinian construction and development and is governed by martial law, while Israeli settlements are governed by Israeli civil courts and Israeli law, and Israeli settlers are eligible to vote in Israeli elections. The Oslo Accords would be opposed by Palestinian Islamist movements such as Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, both offshoots of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood formed in the 1980s, in addition to left-wing parties such as the Marxist-Leninist PFLP, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and DFLP, Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which would continue to refuse recognition of the State of Israel, as well as by ultranationalist Israelis such as Yigal Amir, who would assassinate Rabin on November 4, 1995, for signing the accords. Supporters of the Oslo Accords would praise it as a victory for diplomacy, while critics would note the physical separation of Palestinian territories and lack of substantial Palestinian autonomy. From the time of the end of the Oslo Accords to the year 2002, the Israeli settler population of the West Bank would double. On January 25, 1994, American-Israeli physician and supporter of the ultra-Zionist Koch movement, Baruch Goldstein, would open fire with an assault rifle on a gathering of Palestinian Muslims praying in Ebrahim Mosque in Hebron, West Bank, killing 29 people and wounding 125. On July 25, 1994, King Hussein of Jordan and Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin would meet in the White House in the United States, where they would sign the Washington Declaration, which formally ended the 46-year state of war between Israel and Jordan. On October 26, 1994, they would sign the Israel-Jordan Peace Treaty, which would normalize relations between the two countries, with Jordan becoming the second Arab country to recognize the State of Israel. In April 2000, Israel, under the leadership of newly elected Prime Minister Ehud Barak, would withdraw its forces from southern Lebanon, ending its 15-year occupation of the region. The Oslo peace process would culminate in the Camp David summit of the year 2000, when Palestinian Authority Chairman Yasser Arafat and Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak would enter into negotiations mediated by U.S. President Bill Clinton between July 11th and 25, 2000, in an effort to bring an end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. While the proposals were verbal and no official record of the proposals exists, with there being conflicting reports of what exactly was proposed, various accounts of the summit have reported the following. At the opening of the summit, Ehud Barak would instruct the American delegation that he could not accept giving anything more than symbolic sovereignty over any portion of East Jerusalem. The Palestinian delegation would demand the right of return to Israel proper of Palestinians driven out in 1948, including their children and grandchildren, but would be willing to take into consideration Israel's demographic concerns, promising to implement a mutually agreed upon plan which would attempt to channel the majority of refugees away from the option of returning to Israel, something which the Israeli delegation would refuse, stating that this would pose a demographic threat to Israel's Jewish character. They would, however, state that they would allow a maximum of 100,000 refugees for humanitarian reasons and family unification. The Palestinian delegation would demand complete sovereignty over East Jerusalem, including its holy sites, namely Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, located on the Temple Mount, with Arafat instructing his delegation to quote-unquote not budge on Al-Aqsa, which he described as quote-unquote more precious than anything else. Further, in their proposal, the Jewish quarter and Western Wall would be placed under Israeli authority but not Israeli sovereignty. Palestinian negotiators would propose that they desired full Palestinian sovereignty over the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, noting, however, that they would be willing to consider a one-to-one land swap with Israel. The Palestinian position had been that they had already compromised by accepting Israeli sovereignty over 78% of what was once the mandate of Palestine, and would be accepting a state on the remaining 22% of the lands, expressed in the statement from Israeli politician Faisal Hosseini that quote-unquote there can be no compromise on the compromise. The Palestinian delegation would further affirm that UN Security Council Resolution 242 calls for a final peace agreement involving a complete withdrawal of territories captured in the Six-Day War and dismantling of all Israeli settlements built on the Palestinian side of the Green Line. Israel, having disputed this in the Oslo Accords, desired to annex numerous settlements on the Palestinian side of the Green Line in the West Bank, expressing concerns that a full return to 1967 borders would threaten Israel's security. Barak would offer the establishment of a Palestinian state initially in 100% of the Gaza Strip and 73% of the West Bank, which would expand within the next 10 to 25 years to a maximum of 91% of the West Bank, with an additional 1% for land in the West Bank swapped with land in Israel proper, creating a total of 92% of the land. While the Palestinian and internationally recognized definition of the West Bank included East Jerusalem, the Israeli definition did not, so the Palestinian delegation viewed the offer as a maximum of 86% of the West Bank. The Israelis would propose Palestinian custodianship over the Al-Aqsa compound and administrative control of the Muslim and Christian quarters of the Old City, though not sovereignty, and would propose that the Palestinians merge villages on the outskirts of Jerusalem to form the city of Al-Quds, the Arabic name for Jerusalem, which would serve as the Palestinian capital. Additionally, within the offer proposed to the Palestinians, an Israeli-controlled road from Jerusalem to the Dead Sea would split the West Bank down the middle, and while Palestinians would be provided free passage, Israel would reserve the right to close down the road in the case of an emergency. In return, Israel would allow Palestinians to use a highway in the Negev desert region in Israel to connect Gaza to the West Bank, which would also remain under Israeli sovereignty and which Israel would reserve the right to close in the case of an emergency. Israel would maintain 9% of the West Bank in exchange for providing 1% of the land on the Israeli side of the Green Line to the Palestinians, with Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest site in Islam, being included in the land that the Palestinians would concede to Israel. The 1% of the land conceded to Palestinians would remain unspecified, yet would be within the Al-Aqsa region adjacent to the Gaza Strip, which the Palestinians would reject, stating that it was of inferior quality to the land they would be giving up within the West Bank. Further, within Ehud Barak's offer, Palestinian airspace would remain under Israeli control, the Palestinian state would not be allowed to have military, make alliances without Israeli approval, or host foreign troops within its borders, and Israel would reserve the right to deploy troops on Palestinian territory in the event of an emergency. Other reports stated that instead of dividing the West Bank in two, with the West Bank divided in half by the highway from Jerusalem to the Dead Sea, the plan proposed by Barak and Clinton stated that the West Bank would be divided into 3 cantons, or subdivisions, separated by Israeli settlements and bypass roads and annexed land, with East Jerusalem being a 4th and Gaza being a 5th, with the Palestinian delegation comparing them to the Bantustan enclaves of apartheid South Africa. Additionally, per said reports, Israel would control the border between the West Bank and Jordan. Other reports note a proposal of 92% of the West Bank, 100% of Gaza, dismantling of most settlements, and the concentration of the majority of settlements into the 8% of the West Bank to be annexed by Israel, the establishment of a Palestinian capital in East Jerusalem, with some neighborhoods having full sovereignty, and others possessing quote-unquote functional autonomy, Palestinian sovereignty over the Muslim and Christian quarters of the Old City of Jerusalem, and custodianship, while not sovereignty over the Temple Mount, which houses Al-Aqsa, a return of Palestinian refugees to the new Palestinian state without the right of return to Israel proper, and the organization of an international aid program to oversee the rehabilitation of refugees. The end result of the peace process was that no agreement was reached. Clinton, Olmert, and critics of Arafat would place the failure of the peace process on Arafat's shoulders, stating that he was offered 91% of what he asked for a future Palestinian state, hypothesizing that he never planned to accept the plan to begin with, given that he did not provide a counter-proposal or explicitly state what was wrong with the Israeli offer. Barak would state that Arafat, quote, did not negotiate in good faith. Indeed, he did not negotiate at all. He just kept saying no to every offer, never making any counter-proposals of his own, unquote. Further stating Arafat did not in reality desire a two-state solution, stating that, quote, their game plan is to establish a Palestinian state while always leaving an opening for further legitimate demands down the road, unquote. Continuing that Arafat desired to turn Israel into a quote-unquote state for all citizens, then, quote, they will push for a binational state, and then demography and attrition will lead to a state with a Muslim majority and a Jewish minority. This would not necessarily involve kicking out all of the Jews, but it would mean the destruction of Israel as a Jewish state, unquote. He would additionally state that it would not be possible to split the West Bank into non-contiguous cantons, and that the only division in the West Bank would be a highway which split it down the middle. Arafat would provide little in the form of a rebuttal to these claims. However, one of his aides would state that he remained quiet in order to respect the interests of President Bill Clinton. Subsequent attempts by Clinton to revive the peace process would fall flat, as soon after, Olmert would be replaced by Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon of the conservative Likud party, which opposed the two-state solution in a 2001 election. Sharon's rise to power would spark a deterioration of the situation, first as mentioned due to the collapse of the peace process, and secondly due to a visit he made to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. For context, the Temple Mount was the location of the ancient Jewish temple, first built by King Solomon of the United Kingdom of Israel and Judea, and then built as the so-called Second Temple upon the return of the Jews from exile in Babylon. However, this Second Temple would be destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE during the Jewish Revolt. Nearly 600 years later, this Temple Mount would be the site where the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest site in Islam, would be built. Sharon's visit to the Temple Mount would diverge from precedent, igniting fears amongst Palestinians that Sharon was explicitly endorsing desires amongst ultra-Orthodox Jews to rebuild a third Jewish temple on the site of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. This would lead to the outbreak of another Palestinian uprising known as the Second Intifada, or Al-Aqsa Intifada, which would begin in September 2000 and last until August 2005. While initially being characterized by protests, the uprising would soon escalate into riots, which would be put down by Israeli police using rubber bullets, tear gas, and live ammunition, with the IDF firing millions of rounds of ammunition within the first few days of the unrest. Following violent crackdowns by Israeli forces, this intifada would be characterized by a significantly higher degree of violence in comparison to the first intifada, with suicide bombings being a central feature of the uprising. Beginning in March 2001, Palestinian groups such as Fatah, the largest party within the PLO, but particularly Islamist groups, namely Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, would engage in numerous suicide bombings against Israeli civilian targets, with Hamas engaging in 39.9% of said attacks and Islamic Jihad engaging in 25.7% of attacks. The Israeli military would respond with tank attacks and airstrikes. In total, the Second Intifada would result in the death of over 3,000 Palestinians, roughly 1 to 2/3 being civilians, and over 1,000 Israelis, with roughly half to 80% being civilians. The ratio of Israelis to Palestinians killed would be significantly higher in the Second Intifada than in the first, with 1 Israeli being killed for every 25 Palestinians in the First Intifada, and 1 Israeli for every 2.5 to 3 Palestinians killed in the second. The uprising is considered to have ended at the Sharm el-Sheikh summit on February 8, 2005, when Ariel Sharon and Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas both agreed to cease violence and reaffirm commitment to a roadmap for peace proposed in 2003, and Sharon additionally agreed to release 7,500 Palestinian prisoners held by Israel. While this would bring the Second Intifada to a close, the hostilities would foreshadow a new protracted conflict, which would take place within one particular Palestinian territory, and that territory would be the Gaza Strip. Tune in next time to learn more. Thank you for watching. This has been another Book of Kings video. Don't forget to like, leave a comment, subscribe, hit the bell icon to receive a notification every time I release a new video. And if you enjoy Book of Kings content and would like to support the channel, feel free to donate to the Book of Kings Patreon account. Link is provided in the description.